All right, let's do it. Let's start. Okay, hi everyone again, and welcome. My name is Daniele Brombal, and I'm an associate professor, Department of Asian and North African Studies at the Foscari University, and I'm one of the organizers of this workshop, together with Dr. Giulia Dal Maso and PhD candidate Ali Razmkhah. And so, before starting today's panel, I would like to share a little bit about the context and basically why we are here, and a little bit of the background of this event. So basically, this is part of a wider reflection on the way human beings deal with nature, which has been unfolding in Venice, in recent years, and which has gained a lot of momentum during COVID. So this university, since the 1980s, has been an important place where to study the relationship between human beings and the environment, and it has been also the forefront of the establishment of the environmental sciences in Italy. And along the years in the 80s and 90s, environmental scientists have started also basically joining efforts with social scientists, economists in particular, here in Venice, and they've been achieving notable results science-wise, especially in the study of climate. So probably that was the most successful field of study, which was on which scientists in Venice worked on. Over the course of the last decade, there's been also an increasing engagement, also the humanities and their studies in this and in this effort. And also in the humanities and area studies, there's been a substantial research agenda being developed on trying to figure out the best way to deal with the human-nature relationship. And there's been different drivers for this. On the one hand, of course, there was this global trend towards integration of different disciplinary approaches. And then there's also been a change ongoing in the awareness in the scientific community of the university. And this have taken place both among natural scientists, who came to realize that to trigger change with natural sciences alone are not enough, and so we need also to take care of the cultural and spiritual roots of the environmental crisis, and also an increase in the awareness about the crisis we live in among people in the humanities in the university. Who came to gradually to realize and really feel the kind of situation we are in. And of course, to some extent, all of this was, if you will, facilitated by the fact of working and living in the Lagoon of Venice, because this is one of the places in which you can actually really experience every day how fragile and vulnerable the environment and also human communities can be, especially due to climate change in the lagoon. So this is truly a place where you can, environmental problems, you can really relate to them, and they are part of everyday life, basically. So on this basis, and along with this trend, in recent years, we have been putting a lot of effort to try to strengthen research and teaching agenda, as well as to find ways of social outreach to basically give our small contribution to make sure that human beings can keep thriving on this planet alongside with other living entities. And in terms of research, we have been an increasingly large number of research groups which have sort of embraced these transdisciplinary approaches. And very recently, we have been established a new Center for Environmental Humanities, which is the new Institute Center for Environmental Humanities, thanks to the donation of a German foundation, and which we hope is going to be a platform where to develop these activities. And as for teaching, alongside other established programs, also we have established a Master in Environmental Humanities a couple of years back. It has been quite successful, even though probably I shouldn't say that because I'm deputy head of studies there, but it is what it is. It has been going good, and with a increasingly number of good students there, so we are pretty happy with that. And then of course we have been trying to develop pathways for engage the wisdom and the vision also of communities outside academia, civil society, the public as a whole, and practitioners as well. who share the same commitment we have. And basically, today's workshop is part of this effort. And I'm very happy that we are doing this also together with the ICCA Consortium. Plays a very important role in trying to empower indigenous peoples and local communities who care for their territories. So today and tomorrow we are going to have 3 panels. So today's panel this afternoon, and Giulia is going to introduce that a little bit more in detail in just a couple of minutes, is basically an overview of the core themes of the workshop. Well, tomorrow we are going to zoom in more closely into specific aspects. So the panel in the early morning of tomorrow, which is going to be at starting at 9, will be about the nexus between finance, infrastructures, and the impacts they can have on people and nature, focusing on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a large infrastructural scheme led by China. And the second panel, which is starting at 11 tomorrow morning, is hosted by the ICCA Consortium and will focus on the concerns and visions held by indigenous peoples and local communities living in territories that might be impacted by green finance, basically. Of course, one of the aims we have in all of this, besides sharing contents and hosting discussion, which we hope is going to be lively, it's to start creating a community of people who share the same ethical and scientific concerns, basically. So to this end, and we are going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow after the third panel and the last panel. We're going to circulate a brief report with the main highlights, basically, of this workshop right after it, and then of course keep you informed about other initiatives we may be launching in the next few years on this thing. Last but not the least, the workshop is being recorded because the idea is then to make this available to participants who have registered, because a lot of people who have registered are not going to be able to stay with us for all the panels, also because due to time difference. And so we are going then to make this available. So this is going to be recorded. I think it is all from me right now. So thank you again for being here today. And I leave the floor to Giulia, who is going to give you a little bit more information and the insight about today's panel.
Welcome all to the first panel of this workshop. I'm Giulia Dal Maso and I'm a Marie Curie Fellow here in Foscari, working on the CHINGREEN project, which concerns Chinese-led green sustainable finance along the Belt and Road Initiative. So this 2 days workshop is in fact one of the first action of this research. So this first panel really wants to get to the core of what is commonly defined financialization of nature. Our aim is to really unpack this definition to not only have a clearer picture of how finance has become compatible with nature and its complexity, such as biodiversity, but also to better understand how the market has started to value nature, creating a new system of valuation, which situates also in the wider transformation of capitalism. So through this panel, we want to shed light on the way this growing green finance nexus is constituted at an institutional financial level, what are its criticalities, what we can do to transform it in order to then forge real approaches to conservation. And so to do that, we have a great interdisciplinary panel and a great list of speakers, each with different expertise and perspectives. So before we start, just a few notes on the organizational side, if Daniele hasn't said that already.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so the panel is intended to last for 1 hour and a half. So I'll ask all the speakers to keep their presentation within 15 minutes so we can have time for the discussion at the end. For the audience, if you have pressing questions during the presentation, maybe save it for later. And during the discussion, you can raise your hand to ask questions directly, or again, just write them in the chat and we will read them out loud. So without any further ado, our first panelist is Katie Kedworth, who is both an economist and policy fellow in sustainable finance at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London. Her research focuses on the intersection between finance and the environment. Before joining UCL, Katie worked in capital market, including the Royal Bank of Canada, and she's been really active in the current debate on climate finance with articles in Open Democracy and elsewhere. So Katie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Giulia and Daniele, for inviting me to speak at this, this discussion workshop, which I'm greatly looking forward to. I will just share my screen now. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, so yes, as Giulia mentioned, I'm a policy fellow in sustainable finance at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. Our institute was set up by Professor Mariana Mazzucato in 2017, and it kind of exists to rethink the role of the state and public policy in addressing society's grand challenges. So from its inception, our work programme on this topic, biodiversity loss in the financial system, has really emphasised a constant ongoing dialogue with financial policymakers, and especially central banks and financial supervisors. And that's going to frame, well, basically, I'm going to summarise our research so far, but it's very much in terms of how these particular public institutions, public financial institutions, are thinking through this topic. And our work's been cited in the Dasgupta review and also in policy documents by the White House, the UK Parliament and the Canadian Senate, as well as the most recent IPCC report on climate mitigation. And my colleague Joshua and Collins and I were most recently also participants in a study group on biodiversity and financial stability by a group called the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is basically a group of 100 or so central banks around the world on this topic. So yes, so without further ado, here we go. So yeah, this slide just kind of summarises you know, the initiatives, the plethora of initiatives on biodiversity and finance is now a hot topic within the financial sector. There's lots of stuff going on within both private finance and also policymakers as well. And you know, what the vast majority of these initiatives have in common is that they diagnose biodiversity loss as a market failure problem. So environmental threats are understood to result from, you know, so-called negative externalities, the fact that these threats are not priced into existing markets. And so the emerging consensus on solutions very much positions policymakers, and including financial policymakers, in this position of creating the conditions for markets to resolve this mispricing problem. So in the finance space, what we're seeing is a big focus on initiatives to fill data gaps on biodiversity loss, initiatives on environmental disclosure frameworks to provide more relevant information for financial decision makers, forward-looking risk modelling, methodology type initiatives, and also, of course, the new wave, or calls, I should say, for green financial instruments, new asset classes for nature, as they're, you know, kind of called by some people, which is, you know, just another mechanism of internalizing these externalities back into market pricing. So for financial policymakers, a first and important observation is that market information in relation to finance nature interactions are first and foremost conceptualized in terms of their potential risks posed to the financial system. So risks posed on the private balance sheets of firms. And as maybe, you know, this kind of conceptualization on this slide here kind of originated in the climate finance space. It's now being applied to biodiversity and nature more broadly. But these risks are increasingly understood in terms of physical risks and transition risks. So physical risks being the financial losses resulting from the loss of ecosystem functions, which could be acute or chronic. And then transition risks refer to financial losses that may result from certain sectors being subject to increased regulation or shifts in consumer demand or technology or trade, etc., as the transition to a greener economy progresses. Now, a positive development in recent months, I would say, is that a lot of financial policymakers are increasingly recognising that it's not just risks to the private balance sheet of firms that is important, it's also the impacts caused by financial actors themselves. So this is a so-called double materiality perspective. It's not just financial materiality that's important, it's also environmental materiality. And you can see the obvious feedback effects here in this diagram. You know, the financial system, through its financing activities, facilitates a lot of the harmful activities on nature, and in turn exposes itself to risks in the process. But despite this recognition, the policy approach that's being prioritised is still along the lines of, you know, by getting firms to assess and disclose the risks that nature loss poses to their private balance sheets. So that might be through ESG metrics or disclosure frameworks or scenario analysis. By doing these actions themselves will raise awareness and accelerate a massive reorientation of capital flows away from harmful activities and towards sustainable ones. So in other words, this is a very market-led approach to managing so-called biodiversity-related financial risks, but also a very market-led approach to encouraging the financial system to align with environmental goals. So our first working paper very much tried to challenge the assumptions that underpins this particular policy approach. And you know, we make the argument that first of all, these sorts of financial risks are actually very challenging to quantify. And this is true for climate change as well, but a number of factors make this even more so the case for biodiversity. Because obviously biodiversity and nature need to be captured by multiple different indicators, and they also need to use location-specific data. Biodiversity is obviously, it's not a fungible concept like carbon emissions, so gains in one location are not going to offset losses elsewhere. And this has this complexity and this multidimensionality problem, which poses problems for quantification. This has important implications for policymakers to consider. So on the one hand, a lot of the current initiatives may never actually be able to generate sufficiently good data for financial markets to act upon, for the simple reason that there are lots of unknowns at play. And on the other hand, even assuming a lot of these initiatives come up with a reasonably good set of data points for a financial portfolio, say, risk modelling tools are always going to be inherently limited in their ability to deal with, what was known as radical uncertainty. So situations where there are no meaningful probabilities of future threats. And radical uncertainty obviously characterises both climate change and biodiversity loss and the broader loss of ecosystem services. So, of course, while all of these tools might be very useful for policymakers to kind of explore risks and build a general picture up, they can't be relied upon to capture all risks, which then calls into question them being useful tools to rely upon to drive this kind of massive reallocation of capital that we need to progress the green transition. And then, related to this, a second shortcoming with these approaches is just related to time. Given all of these complexities and uncertainties, it may take many years for reporting and risk modelling and disclosure frameworks to become sufficiently established, during which time a lot of these threats may already be undermining economic and financial stability, or they may already be becoming financially material. So what we argue in our work is that, policymakers really have to address from the very start the presence of a trade-off between knowledge building and actually taking policy action to address these dynamics in the financial system. And the very slow progress of climate risk disclosure initiatives really doesn't provide much encouraging evidence of a favourable outcome from this trade-off. So there have been risk disclosure initiatives for climate risk, which came out 5 years ago now. And despite that, TCFD and these sorts of initiatives have yet to materially affect the investment decisions of the vast majority of financial institutions. So to that end, we argue that the fact that measuring these risks is highly uncertain and complex, this cannot be used as a justification for delaying action to manage them. And we call for policymakers to adopt, what we term a precautionary approach to managing finance nature interactions. And that necessarily means moving beyond incremental market-based mechanisms to use financial policy to actually help shape and accelerate a green transition. And crucial to this is this idea of understanding how to design effective policy on the basis of information available today. So coming back to this little feedback loop diagram, a key provocation that we make is that evidence of financial materiality shouldn't be necessary for policymakers to take action on biodiversity negative financial flows. Seems pretty obvious, but actually, this is not consensus opinion at all among policymakers. What we're saying is the fact that the financial system results in negative impacts upon nature, this is evidence enough for policymakers to take action on it. And the reasons are twofold. Firstly, even if you think in terms of these very narrow financial risk kind of perspective, the fact remains that these risks are endogenous. They're caused by the capital allocation decisions of financial actors themselves. Therefore, you have to address the harmful impacts of finance at source in order to help mitigate system-wide risks. But more importantly, addressing biodiversity loss or climate change or environmental degradation writ large is unlikely to be successful at any level if the global financial system is not aligned with the Paris Agreement, for example, or with the goals that may come out of the global biodiversity framework. So we argue that identifying and reducing the harmful flows of finance is at least a more precise and measurable activity than the kind of time-intensive evolution in risk modelling that's needed to fulfil market-based approaches. So this second perspective effectively shifts the view of finance from merely being an enabling mechanism in this whole agenda to actually a policy goal in itself. It's a strategic leverage point, in other words. And this graphic summarises the IPBES conceptualization of direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. And the question that we're centering ourselves on here is, to what extent is or how is the financial system implicated in the emergence of these human drivers? And this particular framing of the question, I think, is not kind of widely appreciated by financial policymakers yet. They're still focusing on a risk to the system kind of approach, and they're not really appreciating that finance can actually be a lever for change. Anyway, this brings me on to the topic of our second working paper, which is about the AgriFinance Nexus. So this paper was commissioned for the NGFS study group that I mentioned earlier. So it's very much trying to approach this question from the perspective of, how central banks and financial supervisors think about these issues. And what we were briefed to do is basically summarize or, give a perspective on evidence of the negative impacts of finance on biodiversity. And we decided to focus our question on the intersections between finance and the modern agri-food system. Before I get onto that, we started off by briefly reviewing the empirical work out there that aims to quantify impacts of finance on biodiversity. And, setting aside the plethora of private sector-led ESG frameworks out there, which I won't go into, but which, suffice to say, they're not particularly transparent. Apart from those, you can basically distinguish between two main strands of work. First of all, footprint methodologies, which basically assign an estimated biodiversity impact based on portfolio exposures to certain sectors in certain locations. And a second strand of work, which aims to more concretely trace capital flows to particular sectors or activities that are known to be harmful. And moving beyond this, I guess our paper aimed to expand the policymaker focus beyond this current emphasis on fixing prices or quantities of capital to actually consider the broader incentives and institutional factors that might drive financial actors to finance and facilitate harmful activities and persist in doing so. And this question essentially requires, prizing open the so-called black box of finance to consider the actual relations and practices and their variability across different spaces and contexts. Something that obviously the economic geography literature is very well known for. And as I said, we focus on the AgriFinance Nexus, as we call it, the various entanglements between the global financial system and the modern industrialized agri-food system. And we focus especially on the rise of agricultural land as an alternative financial asset class. And the body of the paper basically consists of a review of the findings of a range of empirical and site-specific case studies and theoretical literature, which focus on the financial dynamics underpinning large-scale agricultural land acquisitions at the tropical frontier. And we kind of aim to synthesize perspectives such as those drawing from economic geography and other literatures, and connect it with how financial policymakers are beginning to explore these issues, through the lenses of both financial risk and impact. So just briefly, because I'm running out of time, so I'll fly through my last final slides. So yeah, agricultural land has...
Yes, you have about a minute.
Sorry, how long have I got left?
1 minute, 2 minutes.
Oh, 1 minute. Oh, goodness. Okay. Well, I'll skip that slide then. Briefly, agricultural land has basically emerged as this alternative financial asset class. And there are various sort of actors involved. And the question we wanted to answer is, to what extent are negative biodiversity impacts resulting from the agri-food system actually exacerbated by the import of financial incentives and practices and mechanisms into, the management of agriculture. And so, using the kind of review and synthesis of the literature we did, we kind of tried to map out these incentives and practices and their associated impacts, which you can see in this graphic here. So I don't think I have time to run through that really, but anyway, read the paper. But to move on to the conclusions, the main conclusions we draw from our paper is that, addressing the kind of financial drivers of biodiversity loss is that policymakers really need to move beyond their current focus on correcting the prices or correcting the allocation of capital. There are actually, various institutional relations that connect the kind of macro financial and ecological systems. And actually, many of these processes are taking place beyond the purview of conventional capital market structures. And also, there's the kind of diversity of actors involved are often beyond the usual jurisdictions of financial supervisors and regulators. And, also there are clear kind of spatial asymmetries in the dynamics going on, which, indicates, dynamics of power and political economy that are also relevant to this question. So the implications for policymakers really is that there needs to be a lot more kind of coordination between different types of government institutions, but also internationally, international collaboration to kind of square these dynamics from a global level. I guess I'll leave it there. I'm sorry I ran out of time, but I don't want to encroach on anybody else's presentation. I guess if you have any questions in the chat, then pop them in.
Yeah, so there are two questions in the chat. We can read it now because then you'll have to leave. So this is an exception. We won't do that with the other speaker. But so there are two questions from Friedrich. The first one is, do you have data supporting the idea that the reallocation of capital would be more effective via economic incentives rather than traditional environmental regulation? What is the risk that incremental market-based mechanisms displace other more important and effective policy tools rather than complement them?
Okay, yeah. Hello,
if
Frederick.
You can be brief as...
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, just to elaborate on our the precautionary financial policy approach, which I alluded to earlier, what we basically say is that these kind of incremental market-led approaches are not going to work. They're not going to be effective. And actually, perhaps in cases of like high uncertainty, sometimes it's the simplest tool which need to be, proxy for the most effective action. So we actually actually are supportive of greater use of financial regulation in order to steer finance and guide it in the right direction. And we sort of call for financial policymakers to shift from having this market fixing role to more of a market shaping role, where they're using the policy toolkits, financial regulation, to actually shape the direction in which market actors can innovate towards in support of the green transition. So more concretely, in terms of a concrete policy option, well, actually, no, I'll leave it there because I don't want to waste any more time.
Well, the next one is actually related to that, because what is the risk, in your view, that the unknowns that you mentioned and relate to high scientific regulatory risk and uncertain can put off the investors? I mean, I reframe it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think that's exactly why we need to have policy here to make sure finance is actually going in the right direction, and it doesn't just kind of like withdraw from places which urgently need capital in order to invest for the green transition. So, the dynamics in low-income countries are especially relevant here. A lot of them are really vulnerable to physical risks. They have high uncertainty in terms of, socioeconomic dynamics. And these are the sorts of places where, like, finance capital is not going to readily pour into unless it's got other kind of incentives guiding it there. And I mean, more broadly, there's obviously a risk. There's a move towards kind of like blended finance and stuff like that. And I think there are obviously political economy risks there which need to be managed. But more generally, perhaps the low-income country example is a bad one, actually. Let's choose a different example. Say building retrofits for low-income families. That's not an area where a bank is necessarily going to be comfortable to lend to. However, those sorts of citizens need low-cost finance in order, or zero-interest finance, actually, I would argue, in order to accelerate the transition. And that's exactly the sort of example where financial regulation can steer banks. It can mandate them to provide certain quotas of green lending, for example, to ensure that these high-risk categories in financial risk terms actually are still served by the financial system. So yeah, that's exactly the kind of role for regulation to play. It can create a path through uncertainty and help market actors to still serve society, essentially.
No, thanks so much, Katie. I think that's interesting what you're saying about also the challenges of, issue of quantification and neoclassical economics approaches and risk modeling. And so, the fact that central banks and financial regulators should think outside their box really lead us to the other presentation of today. So we have two geographers, in fact, and political ecologists, Jessica Dempsey and Audrey Irvine Brock from British Columbia. Jessica is a professor of geography, and she's been working on the issue of finance and biodiversity conservation for several years. She's the author of Enterprise in Nature, a book published by the Antipode series in 2016. Both Jessica and Audrey are the authors of an important paper that has been published in Nature at the beginning of this year, which has in a way sparked the debate on the inability and failure of private finance alone to positively impact biodiversity. So today, Jessica and Audrey will present a review paper that they did for the NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System, Inspired Central Bank Study Group, which will further articulate, how other approaches to financing biodiversity are needed. So, Jessica and Audrey, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Daniel, Giulia, and Ali for your work organizing and for inviting us. I also just want to say I'm coming to you from Vancouver, British Columbia, which is Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. These are the indigenous nations to whom I'm doubly indebted as an uninvited guest on their territory. And so that's the first debt. And the second debt is because they're often leading the way on resisting extractivism that leads to both climate change and biodiversity loss. So as Giulia said, I'm Jess Dempsey. I work at UBC in the Department of Geography, and I'm presenting today with Audrey Irvine Broke, a graduate student. Audrey and I are part of a large multi-institutional grant, Tracing Biodiversity Capital, which is funded by the Canadian government. We have team members at Lancaster, Duke, Copenhagen, and we've been trying to understand and follow these attempts to make nature investable for more than 30 years collectively, at least. And the research we're presenting today draws from this much larger group. And the names are listed here. And so along with Katie, we were Kedward, who I met as a part of this study group on biodiversity and financial stability that's already been mentioned. This study group was aiming to inform central banks and financial supervisors of the risks of biodiversity loss. And as a part of that study group, we were tasked with reporting on the track record of financial instruments that seek to positively contribute to sustainable use and conservation of biodiversity. So kind of the flip side of the work that Katie was doing, actually. So this means, of course, kind of private return-oriented investments in companies and projects like ecotourism, payments for ecosystem services, sustainable agriculture and forestry, REDD+, ecosystem carbon credits, etc. And today our plan is to quickly present the results as we presented them to the study group, and then pivot to talk about alternatives. So Audrey, thank you. Given our long-term research focus, we're familiar with much of the research on these financial mechanisms, both from many international organizations like the OECD and from NGOs and think tanks. There's always a lot of flurry of reports that go on around this topic, but also from our own field research, from really top to tail, so from the financial mechanism to the investment on the ground. For example, one of my collaborators, Patrick Bigger, and I examined investments claiming to be biodiversity positive that landed in Kenya. They moved into forest carbon offsets in Rukinga. That's the photo that of sequestered carbon on your left, I think. And a microforestry business on the coast, Kilifi, where they were planting the very biodiverse eucalyptus. They argue this fiber source replaces the use of natural forests for energy sources. In drafting this report for the central banks study group, we kept at the fore the insights of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and their conclusions, of course, about the scale of efforts needed to reduce biodiversity loss. So to what extent, we kept asking ourselves, do these financial mechanisms contribute to addressing what is driving biodiversity loss? So we have 6 key insights to share about this. The first one is probably obvious to many of you here, but it's not always actually to people who are not familiar in this sector because of the hype that circulates. And this is that investment in return generating conservation projects remains low. There are low rates of return, high risk, long timelines, and high transaction costs that all hinder investment and scalability. The table we have here shows 2 asset classes. So private equities found to contribute about $2 to $3 billion a year, and green bonds, depending on how you classify, from $1 to $14 billion a year. This sounds big, depending on who you are and where you come from. But of course, it's important to place these flows into the context of the much larger flows of finance to sectors that degrade biodiversity, which are well into the trillions. Our second point is that these mechanisms really lack consistent use of science-based metrics or monitoring for biodiversity outcomes. The proxies used are often very, very coarse and do not necessarily correspond with biodiversity impact. So take these estimates of green bonds. The higher estimates, the 14.5 billion, are drawn from what are categorized as land use green bonds, which includes agriculture, commercial forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture, all of which may have negative impacts on biodiversity. Only half of these land use green bonds cite impact in terms of area conserved, protected, built, itself a very crude and inadequate metric for biodiversity impact. So essentially, these estimates that circulate around the size of for-profit biodiversity conservation finance may not accurately reflect the size of positive investment. And our literature review shows that similar impact measurement problems appear in many PES projects, even those designed to have positive impacts on biodiversity. So here, just actually going to Danielle's point at the beginning, this is why we need scientists to be working with finance, because I think there's a real need, just for example here, on really science-based scrutiny of what's happening in finance right now to measure, say, biodiversity impact. And we also found that many of these metrics are very much behind proprietary paywalls. And so it's very difficult to have scrutiny of them. And that's something that we're working on. Actually, Audrey's leading a paper on that right now. So just back to our key lists, our insight. Our third point is that the geographical distribution of this kind of investment does not always match with areas of high biodiversity. This depends on the mechanism, of course, but much of the private investment is flowing in the north. Our fourth point was that as much research has shown, projects can have, much political ecology research, I would say, has shown projects and can have negative social impacts, such as contributing to increased community conflict, dispossession, and even violence. There is variation, of course, and what we emphasize in this report is that projects that do have demonstrated positive social and biodiversity outcomes, these are very difficult to replicate and scale due to high transaction costs, low returns and liquidity, these very lengthy community consultation processes, and long timeframes for investments. So these projects that are found to be good on a number of aspects are extremely pricey. Given the above, and to our fifth point, many financial mechanisms for biodiversity depend on blended finance, an approach where public or philanthropic capital de-risk or subsidize private investments through concessional lending, first loss guarantees. Katie mentioned this. We don't have time to review all the research today, but its record in even more straightforward development or infrastructure projects is spotty at best. And here's, of course, the problem of socializing risk and privatizing gain. And our final point we'll make today is just to flag that these efforts to make biodiversity investable have a long history. They go back to at least Rio in 1992 and the formulation of the Biodiversity Convention, where it was thought that the genetic resources found in intact tropical forests would become an investable asset leading to conservation. Some of you may remember that. That was the hubbub at that time. As the climate agenda, in particular the carbon market, ramped up, energy turned in the mid-2000s to the possibility of climate action also funding biodiversity conservation. Some of you may recall the 2008 UK-sponsored ELIASH report, which concluded that including REDD and a carbon trading system would provide billions in finance to reduce deforestation rates. The reality is that those markets have faced long-standing serious challenges scaling up, as well as a spotty record on carbon sequestration, biodiversity impact, and land rights. Now, efforts are, of course, always underway to advance further investment in biodiversity positive investments and overcome these challenges. I'd be happy to talk with all of you about those efforts in the Q&A, and particularly around the forest carbon market. But as researchers and analysts in this space, we've studied these efforts for a long time. We have to ask the question, is this time different? And if so, why? Given that these biodiversity positive investments are marginal and unproven, particularly when you compare it to the scale and impact that is called for by the IPBES, our primary recommendation in the report to central banks and financial supervisors is that they avoid deploying resources towards promoting or expanding these financial products. The market is not responding to systemic biodiversity risk, and there is little evidence that it will or can at the pace and scale needed to address them. And I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about how this recommendation was received by this group. And now I'm going to pass it to Audrey, who's going to just quickly reference this piece we recently published in Nature. Audrey.
Great, thanks, Jess. Yeah, so
if, as we concluded, private biodiversity finance isn't the answer for meeting IPBS's calls for transformative change, then we asked kind of what other financial strategies might be. And so based on a larger report that we published in collaboration with the Third World Network that tried to situate the funding gap for biodiversity conservation within the global economy, we wrote this commentary for nature, ecology, and evolution, and we tried to propose 2 alternative measures that we thought could challenge some of the dominance of gap talk within the negotiations. And so those are debt and tax justice. And this is a diagram that we made to accompany the piece, and it's an attempt to show how the dominant discourse of finance and biodiversity, which is shown here kind of above the waterline, if you will, might move beyond classifying direct positive or negative flows of finance on biodiversity, and instead, or also to address the underlying conditions that drive these patterns, particularly for developing countries. So these conditions include race to the bottom corporate tax rates, patterns of debt and austerity, and these act as indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So for example, conditions on sovereign debt for developing nations often incentivize or require exports and extractivism in order to earn foreign currency, driving biodiversity loss. And this is recognized by the head of the convention. But also, as a result of the conditions on these and repayment terms on these debts, these same debts form an impediment to public spending on public goods, including the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And so, understanding that the structure of the global economy won't be transformed overnight, we tried to put forward reforms that we felt could chip away at these conditions while not totally transforming them. But as a result of our work and some collaborative advocacy with Third World Network and many others who work on the CBD negotiations, the subsidiary body on implementation of resource mobilization text now includes the first mention of debt and austerity to be found within the text of a CBD decision. You can see here highlighted. And this text is still in brackets, which means that it's not accepted yet. But it is, I think, a development that points to the possibilities of shifting some of the terms of the debate and some of the ways that biodiversity loss and its relationship to the financial system is understood, not only as flows going to or outside of biodiversity conservation, but kind of grounding it in a larger understanding of what drives these investments and what these conditions are that produce biodiversity loss. In addition to sovereign debts, we also want to recognize the ecological debts, the ongoing ecological debts, which are incurred to developing countries, including significant losses of biodiversity, which have not been compensated for by developing nations. When these issues are raised, however, as you can see on screen, we are arguing that they should not be treated as barriers to negotiations, but as central to them, and should inform how funds for CBD targets are raised and distributed, notably through the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So currently Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework draft calls for an increase in financial resources to at least 200 billion per year, but only 10 billion is going to developing countries, which is a far cry from what is owed and has been a recent point of contention in the negotiations. We also wanted to highlight that part of the rationale for why 200 billion is the number is that there's this idea that if you were to reform the 500 billion that has been linked to harmful subsidies, you would reach the 700 billion and therefore fill the funding gap that has been proposed. But we just want to raise that conversations about removing subsidies, important as they aren't in line with the convention's commitment to CBDR, given that these subsidies are domestic funds. And so overall, just the point is that the amount of funding for conservation targets should address CBDR, but also the economic structures that constrain possibilities for public spending. And these themselves are, of course, a relic of colonialism and uneven development. So just to close, I think as there are emergent calls to move towards a nature-positive global economy, we just think it's necessary to continue asking what kind of global economy is becoming nature positive and who will be exposed to the risks and vulnerabilities of these existing patterns of uneven development in these attempts. Yeah, thanks. Looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Jessica and Audrey. And this has provided a very powerful insight on what are the limitations on market-based approaches and how finance need to be transformed. So our next speaker is Andrea Armani, who is the co-founder and director of an NGO called Transform Finance, which was born on similar premises, maybe, so to rework and revolutionize mainstream financial approaches. So Andrea, over to you.
Great. Thanks to Giulia, Daniele, and Ali for organizing, and to my fellow speakers. I feel like I already learned a lot just from listening to you, with the disclaimer that biodiversity is not my area of expertise specifically. My focus is on how capital more broadly affects social justice outcomes. So touching on some of the issues that have already been brought up, which will be my focus today, sort of the S in ESG, as it were, the impact on indigenous communities in particular, and at large, what does it mean when we give finance a role on something like the protection of biodiversity. I'll also disclaim that while I teach at New York University, I am not an academic in a research sense. So hopefully there won't be hard academic questions like, where is the data to back up what I'm saying? It's largely conceptual or anecdotal. So I started looking at these issues first when during a brief stint teaching at Université Paris-Dauphine in France in sustainable development, and being somewhat dismayed by what the framing of sustainable development as still being kind of a deeply growth-oriented space that was a little bit less bad. And from there, I ended up working in Colombia on issues of self-determination for indigenous communities in the Colombian Amazon, at a time when they were facing an influx of interest from carbon credits projects, payment for ecosystem services. And these communities, they're very traditional in the way that we can think about it. They still live in an economy of solidarity. We're constantly saying, like, wait a second, what is this thing that you're talking about when you say that we're going to get paid for preserving the carbon? The carbon doesn't belong to us. We belong to the trees. This has nothing to do with our view of the world and our role in it. And frankly, it's starting to sound a lot like the last 500 years, when first it was gold, then it was rubber, now it's carbon. Like, nobody asked us. People are coming here with the ideas of giving us money for doing what we should be doing in the first place, right? There was really a big disconnect between the proposed interventions and almost this idea like, hey, shouldn't you be happy that we're giving you money for what you're doing anyways? And almost not realizing that, no, there are plenty of communities that might say, no, actually, that's not a good thing. On the one hand, from a practical perspective, because it interferes with their existing economy of solidarity and exchange, brings them into a market logic that is not necessarily theirs, and that they had already been proven to be problematic in other cases where there had been alliances, say, between big multinationals like the Avida brand of cosmetics, saying, "Oh, we're going to be sourcing these things from the Amazon." And as those projects failed, the communities found themselves isolated from the circles in which they used to be in solidarity. All this by way of framing the question of, okay, what happens if, even when investors ostensibly are trying to do the right thing, they miss the mark in terms of what the communities might want, what are their needs, what are their aspirations, and how are they ultimately affected by the interventions. And thinking about the framing of my fellow panelists earlier, there is one aspect of finance that is, again, the strand of mitigating the negative impact that current capital flows have on biodiversity. And the other is whether finance can also be part of that solution. And I posit that just because finance has been part of the problem in terms of reduction of biodiversity, we need to question a little bit more whether it is the right conceptual space where we can find a solution. And yes, there might be some instances where that is the case. I think it was Katie earlier that mentioned, financing retrofits. Great, we need the right type of capital for financing retrofits. But for a lot of interventions, maybe the fundamental risk, thinking about the title of this workshop, the financialization of nature, there is almost a privatization of a public sphere, a reduction to a market logic that might not be the most suited, as we saw when we're hearing about the current size of this market. In order to grow the space of finance for biodiversity, you need to create the right incentives for the investors. The returns need to be right. Things need to be structured in a way that is compelling to them, which sort of puts their needs kind of above those of the biodiversity question, right? So we're not coming at the projects that are being financed from the perspective of which projects most need support, where needs biodiversity to be protected or enhanced, and instead saying, well, okay, of all the universe of opportunities that there are, which ones will be compelling to investors, right? We're kind of crowding out the space of protection per se, let's say, and turning it into something that can be stimulating for the investors themselves. Now, turning it back to the idea of what about the people, right? There is generally an assumption, there are two things. One is the problem of current kind of green investments having focused very much, at least until a couple of years ago, on just measuring up the positive impacts that they're having, right? You would say, oh, look, I am preserving a certain amount of, or sequestering a certain amount of carbon, I'm reducing emissions here and there, but there was no countervailing disclosure on, well, what could be the negative impacts that come with that. And we saw that coming to life in an example in Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, where there was a major wind project coming in, and on land that is owned by indigenous communities in the form of ejido, right, and kind of a shared common ownership. And the project proponents were suggesting, really miserly financial contributions for the local community, but with the idea of saying, hey, isn't this better than nothing? You're just fishing here. Why do you care if we give you a little bit of money for putting up wind turbines? And it was met with protests, going back to the point earlier about some of the dangers that there have been in terms of community strife, violence against protectors of rights and the like. And the community ended up rejecting the project and really kind of pushing it out, but with a twist of saying, well, actually, we want it, but on our own terms, right? We want to have a project that is consistent with our own life vision and where we will have ownership and governance. They were saying in Spanish, eólico sí, pero no así, right? Yes to wind, but not in this way. It can't just be imposed on us. And so I submit that the role of community engagement in anything that is biodiversity related is super important. Again, my fellow speakers noted earlier that many of these projects are located in the global south. There are people living where these projects are taking place. And in the case at least of indigenous groups, there are legal protections under free, prior, and informed consent that are in the research that we've seen so far and that we collaborated with from the Business and Human Rights Research Center, they're often violated. Right, there is definitely lacking processes of free, prior, and informed consent. There is a need for the translation to the communities that have been excluded to really try to help them understand, not in a swindling way, but to say, okay, what would this mean for you? Where is the upside? Who is getting rich off of this process? And in the case of a lot of green investments, you see a lot more value being created for financial intermediaries than for anyone else. And I don't think it's enough if we are looking at finance as part of the solution to say, oh, great, this is better than nothing, or this is better than Exxon, right? When the problem is at such a scale, we really need to make sure that there is both enough impact being created, and we're not aggravating issues of wealth extraction or of wealth inequality. Now, this might all be seeming very like high level and abstract, but I think we can easily tie it back to the reality of these interventions by asking that initial question of like, should this really even be in a space where we are abdicating the decisions around biodiversity to private investors, right? Private investors are not, or public investors, whoever, like holders of assets are not representative of the population at large. Generally, they have their own entrenched interests, and I'm deeply worried by this idea that they are the ones that get to decide which kind of biodiversity interventions should be prioritized, and that the profitability of them should be part of the logic. Now, I don't know if that's compelling at all, because I also want to leave a little bit of hope that, yeah, there is a small space where one says, look, these are all worthwhile considerations. However, not enough money is flowing, right? The UN keeps saying that with the Sustainable Development Goals, so we need more capital to flow. We have a $1.3 trillion capital gap. But should that really be private capital? Should be profit-oriented capital? If it doesn't come from anywhere else and we really need to make these investments, sure, but I see it more as like a last resort type of opportunity. And to the extent that we pursue it, we need to put more of an emphasis on, what could go wrong, who is bearing the risk of these interventions, which other interventions are not being pursued because we're going with the financial ones. Who will bear the consequences when many of these projects go wrong, or how are we creating additional negative impacts by disrupting more traditional ways of living, more traditional ways of engaging in economic systems that have not yet embraced wholesale the logic of the market and the logic of capitalism. So, and I'd love to hear more examples of where that has worked well, right? But I don't think that we have that many instances where one can say there was a private finance intervention in issues of biodiversity conservation where nobody was screwed over in the process, and it was the right one to take on, and it didn't create these unintended consequences. So I will leave it at that as just a general remark, and then we can get into it more.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Andrea. I think very interesting presentation, full of concrete example and important perspective from the investor and the community. We will talk about that more probably tomorrow as well, but also on the challenges on how to allocate capital, and if it's right or not. So after this, we have a concluding presentation by Mark Brightman, who is professor of anthropology at the University of Bologna and principal investigator of the ERC-funded project Impact How, which adopts an anthropological lens, in fact, to research impact and sustainable finance at a global level, and in particular bonds, green bonds and sustainable bonds. So Mark will provide us with a reflection on financialization and biodiversity by presenting on a case study which concerns a blue bond in the Caribbean. So Mark, the floor is yours.
There may be a problem with the audio. So Mark, we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay, so you can see my slide, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Good, right. Hello, everybody, and sorry I joined a little bit late. Right, so yes, I'm going to talk about a well-known case study from the Caribbean, the Belize blue bond. And I have to say, I mean, I've worked on some other aspects of biodiversity before, especially in the context of REDD+, where I did some research in Suriname a few years ago on capacity building and on the work of Conservation International with TRIO, and the different ways in which indigenous people and conservationists perceive biodiversity and how they communicated with each other to get around that. So some of the things that Andrea was saying early in his presentation were very familiar to me. But this is a new thing that I'm working on, which I find really fascinating, but this is very early stage. So these are some initial thoughts, and I haven't yet done field research. So this is kind of on the level of hypothesis, you might say. But first, I wanted to make some general points about what is financialization in the first place. I don't know whether there's been much discussion of this basic point yet in the first part, in the first presentation, which I missed. But I mean, basically, it's the expansion of the financial sector, right, into all kinds of areas of life. It's actually a very general term for a phenomenon that has been a feature of globalization for the last several decades. And okay, if you look at the Wikipedia definition, you get some more specific points like increases in debt to equity ratios, increasing share of national income, of financial services, and so on. Right, but as anthropologists who study financialization are particularly interested in seeing how, as Karen Ho puts it, a constellation of priorities, practices, and ideologies are mobilized to convert existing assets into income streams, and to realize these assets as liquid monetary forms intersecting cultural, material, political, and legal transformations need to occur. So there's a whole kind of percolation into all kinds of areas of society and culture on all kinds of different levels, in institutions, but also in everyday life, which are implicated by financialization, entailed by it. And so we talk about things like the financialization of everyday life, which happens particularly through digitalization, which allows all kinds of things, for health insurance and people's habits to be effectively monetized and have financialized kind of risk evaluations attached to them. But I think that the financialization of biodiversity works a little bit differently from this kind of financialization of everyday life. So what is biodiversity after all? I think that actually biodiversity shares some of its history with the emergence of financialization. So biodiversity is concerned with how to define and measure variety, how to value it. There are different types of measures: species diversity, ecological diversity, genetic diversity, and so on. Jeffrey Bowker has discussed the emergence of the concept of biodiversity as having much in common with the emergence of money and with the emergence of bureaucracy, and it has common features with these human achievements, if you like, these features of civilization, which are associated with the origins of writing and accounting, these evaluative practices, if you want, which are practices that are extremely powerful, and they're ways of kind of accounting for all of life, giving everything a value, making them commensurable. And they're also kind of associated with, according to Bowker, the end times. They have eschatological features, and there's something kind of millennial about measuring biodiversity. It sort of evokes the end of the world, if you like. So what about, anthropologists have connected money to memory, and biodiversity lends itself to economic approaches by rendering comparable and commensurable different things: a species, a wetland, pollutants. If they can be given a biodiversity value, a monetary value, they can be exchanged for each other. And of course, this is what makes the financialization of biodiversity theoretically possible. The biodiversity discourse emerged actually through economic policy frameworks like the OECD's programmatic definition of sustainable development. And the idea of biotic diversity, which is what biodiversity used to be called, has long had financial dimensions. And even already in 1980, the IUCN summarized these early ideas about biotic diversity as having insurance and investment benefits, concepts, of course, which come from finance, right? The maintenance of options for future generations, which is provided by biodiversity as variety, hedging your bets, if you like. So I want to raise this question: is biodiversity being financialized, or are biodiversity accounting and financialization two aspects of a wider phenomenon, part of what anthropologists have called audit culture? So now I'm going to just introduce the Belize Blue Bond. I'm going to try to go quite quickly because I think I only have we have 15 minutes or so, right? These are just a few extracts from the biodiversity plan for Belize under the CBD. It talks about ecosystem services, how Belize it actually says it's founded on its biodiversity wealth, which is a slightly odd statement, but I think this means not historically founded, but that its foundations, its kind of economic foundations, are rooted in its biodiversity wealth, considered as natural capital, right? And particularly important is the Belize Barrier Reef Reserve System. Important economically because of the fishing resources that are there. It supports more than 50% of the Belize population. And then in this report, in this document, we have an enumeration of the globally threatened species, according to the IUCN, river turtles, sawfish, and of course, the industries that rely on this: agriculture, fishing, but above all, tourism thrives on, and fishing, of course, thrive on the reef system and on the fisheries, right? And well, I mean, I've surveyed a few of the studies of threats to marine conservation in Belize, heavy reliance on fishing, threats to, well, this is how they characterize the threats to biodiversity. They characterize them in terms of threats to specific species. So rather than this is where you have a departure from the kind of accounting practice that the idea of biodiversity is associated with, because here you have the threats to specific species, and yes, you have enumerations of all the different species, the number of species, but then the threats to each species tend to be, when it really comes down to it, tend to be qualitative. So it's the enumeration tends to be in the number of species that are at risk, right? And it's only when you get down to really small numbers of species that you actually have an enumeration of the number of species of that species that are left. Okay, but so these challenges are really governance challenges, if you like, biodiversity governance challenges, conservation challenges, which becomes a matter of governance because of the economic dimensions of these conservation challenges, right? And so the Belize Blue Bond, well, it's presented as one of these famous win-win solutions that's going to not just protect biodiversity, but also address Belize's grave national debt problem. And reading the Belize budget speech of 2020 of last year, the kind of rhetoric that's used in it is really very strong. I mean, the national debt is the great problem in this country. The speaker describes it as breathtaking, the equivalent of $10,000 for every man, woman, and child. It's the 6th most indebted country in the world. And so the Nature Conservancy came up with this idea for a blue bond, a debt for nature swap, which is something which has been discussed for a couple of decades now, this kind of arrangement, which would restructure the entire external commercial debt of $546 million US, reducing existing debt service costs while securing funding for conservation activities. That's from the Credit Suisse, which structured and arranged the bond. So, I mean, I think it's probably most helpful to look at this summary from NatureVest, which is the financial arm of the Nature Conservancy, which describes how it was picked up. I mean, I don't want to go through the details too much, because I think if you're interested in those, you can take your time to read through the slides. But I mean, I think and also this slide, which is again from NatureVest, gives you an overview of the structure. I mean, I think that a key thing to understand it is the creation that the Nature Conservancy created a securitization vehicle. Well, two vehicles actually. The Nature Conservancy has a vehicle called BIC, and Credit Suisse has this securitization vehicle, and this allows the purchase of the debt by these vehicles to allow it to be restructured, essentially. And this has been celebrated as a model of how to achieve a debt for nature swap. It allows the creation of the freeing up of capital for $5 million a year for conservation, plus the creation of a fund which will be treated as an endowment that will be usable after 20 years. That's intended to fund the conservation in perpetuity, right? So let me see. I mean, I'm going to just skip a bit because I'm really conscious of time.
Yeah, you have 1 or 2 minutes, Max.
1 or 2 minutes, okay. Yeah. Right. Well, what I wanted to say here is really that the finance disciplines the governance of biodiversity in Belize here. So the accumulation and the release of the funds over time is written into the arrangement, which defines an overarching program for conservation. But the biodiversity audit isn't tied to the financial arrangement. everyday life of biodiversity, if you like, isn't actually financialized. Instead, it structures the conditions for biodiversity governance. Now, I mean, one thing that I noticed here is that the Belize Blue Bond program is 4 times larger than its precursor, which was the Seychelles Blue Bond, which provided a kind of model for it. But the Seychelles Blue Bond is protecting 400 square kilometers of ocean, and Belize only protects 10,000 square kilometers. So, clearly, there's more biodiversity going to be protected by the Seychelles for a far lower price. So the calculation is obviously not going to be based on the dollar values of biodiversity here, but on a whole set of other circumstances, financial circumstances, negotiations with bondholders, and so on. Is there any reason to think that better funding for conservation will translate into better conservation outcomes? It's not really clear. What I do have from my colleague who's in the field right now in Seychelles is that industrial fishing is still going on in the Seychelles marine conservation areas where it's not supposed to be. So far, it's not really clear that it's working. So I think, I mean, there are criticisms of the financial sustainability of the Belize Blue Bond, which I didn't have time to talk about. The main criticism actually harks back to the paper that we heard earlier, that it's important to involve multilateral and domestic lenders in restructuring debt, and this case only deals with commercial lenders, which isn't really enough to solve Belize's financial problems. I don't think this is anything particular to biodiversity, however. I think this is more of a general point about the problem of sovereign debt. But I would also say, I mean, the Nature Conservancy, look at the size of their logo next to the logo of the Ministry of the Blue Economy and Civil Aviation here, where they're presenting the naming of the new Belize Fund for a Sustainable Future. There is kind of a whiff of conservation colonialism here. The Nature Conservancy is basically running the show, even though the fund itself isn't strictly controlled by either them or by the ministry, but is supposed to be autonomous. So ring-fencing government spending for conservation may be a positive thing, but there is this kind of whiff of neocolonialism. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, there is a lot here, and there are issues of quantification and depth that keep coming up in the presentation. So we are short on time because actually this panel was supposed to finish right now, but we can still, if people want to stay around, I hope that you all do a bit more. We can have a few questions. So I'll start to a question to Mark. So by Michela Bonato, which asks you, do you see a loss of national sovereignty in the future of Belize in terms of biodiversity property, and so in terms of national resources?
Well, to be honest, it's hard for me to answer that at this stage because it's so early in my research on this. But especially with not having yet done field work. But I mean, from what I can tell so far, I think there's a strong argument on both sides. I mean, part of the reason for Belize entering into this arrangement is to try to protect what they see as their biodiversity property, which they see as yes, okay, as natural capital, but as really the wealth of their country, what the wealth of their country is founded upon. So I think my understanding from reading the discussions at a ministerial level on this is that politically it's a way of preserving their sovereignty rather than the opposite. But yeah, it does make them rather dependent on Nature Conservancy. I don't know exactly how their relationship with Nature Conservancy works, though. On the surface of it, it can look like neocolonialism, but is that actually there are lots of Belizean locals working for the Nature Conservancy. It's difficult to give a straight answer, really.
Okay, I will read another question, which is for, I suppose, all the speaker, by Laura Terzani. She asked, how can financial markets handle the radical uncertainty associated with biodiversity science and the 6 extinction species, when markets have been shown to be only able to manage risk? So the lowest form of uncertainty where all outcomes and related probabilities are known. So in other words, beyond the obvious environmental integrity question, doesn't biodiversity market finance create high financial stability risks? I don't know if one of the speakers wants to answer that. Maybe Jessica? Jess?
Yeah, sure. Others, I'm sure, will have things to say, but I think it's a really interesting and insightful comment from Laura. And one of the ways we raised this in our report within the scope of what we were asked to do, which was to say that particularly given the weak form of monitoring or kind of oversight over claims made about both avoiding risks related to biodiversity and also positively contributing to biodiversity, there's a lot of greenwashing essentially that's going on, and this is widely understood. And so in that case, that's a really concrete way where you would see that a market-led risk approach would actually be creating more stability risks which is the concern of like a central bank. So the lack of regulatory oversight in terms of claims of, say, we're being nature positive or we're avoiding the worst kind of impacts on biodiversity, the lack of regulatory oversight and sort of science, like a sort of science-based approach to that is itself like creating risk, because it creates the illusion that actually finance is doing something about its contributions to biodiversity loss when but the actual kind of impact is very unknown. And yeah, so that's one comment I would say.
Yeah, but considering that, I see that most of the comments were already kind of entered in the chat. I wanted to ask you then to tell us what was the reaction of regulators after that review paper, what you mentioned before that you were happy to share with us. Well,
I was surprised because I thought we had done a very kind of conservative, in my view, analysis, and the response was that our recommendations, which were to central banks and financial supervisors, should not really play in this pond, right? Like if you imagine like the levers for central banks, one of them might be that they would say reduced capital. They would have some policies that would positively, this is my dog, to incentivize more investments in so-called biodiversity positive projects. And so it was considered to be, what was the word that they used? Audrey might remember better than me, but that it was seen as quite radical of a recommendation, which was essentially to say, just don't do this thing. It wasn't to say like, and to regulate it as well was a secondary thing. But the first thing we said was like, don't go here. It could create more risks. It's not productive. And yeah, it was seen as a bit of a kind of radical and recommendation. But in the end, almost all of our, Audrey just put it in the chat, the final study group report, but actually a lot of our stuff was taken up.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, so I wasn't sure what I was doing in this study group, to be honest. And it turns out that you can, that it was worthwhile, because I think they were really convinced by especially these questions of track record and the longer durée. And I think that for many was seen as like evidence enough in a way. So.
Are there other comments, maybe even among the speakers that wants to interact? Maybe Andrea.
Not really, except that I hate having left everyone with such a dismal view of the possibilities. I'm thinking about where this little space is with higher governmental intervention, because I very much agree with that need for putting some guardrails, and then there would be more of this role for finance. But there has been, as we see in other spaces, Katie mentioned previously the work of Mariana Mazzucato with the group that she's involved in. But there is a very clear role that can't be abdicated in terms of putting out the rules and the guardrails, and then the private sector should come in. It shouldn't be the other way around, where the private sector says, "Oh, this is really hard financial structuring, leave it to us, and we will figure it out." So, but that's a political equation type of question that probably we won't be solving in the next couple of minutes.
Yeah. I mean, it's often political, the issue. Mark, do you have any comment?
I just saw that Ali has his hand up.
Oh, Ali, keep.
After you, Mark. After you.
It's okay. I don't have a particular comment.
Ali,
right now.
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, then, so sure. Thank you everyone for your wonderful and interesting presentation. Thank you for your sharing your knowledge and science with us. I'm just, let's say that I don't have any knowledge and clue about financial issue and the money, and this is why my personal life is not very rich. But I work with communities for many years as a lawyer and human rights defender. So I know communities, and I know the field, I know the biodiversity. And when I listen to all of you, I was thinking that very basically, why we even need some, let's say, financialization, why we need to commodify the biodiversity, when even it seems that many people still look at biodiversity is something just pure nature. They don't look at community. They don't look at people. They don't at as the connected culture and history with this biodiversity that no one can monetize them. So how we can how we can recognize not needs, actually, as Andrea mentioned, the rights of local community, the rights of indigenous people that actually conserve for many years this biodiversity. And then after almost 100 or almost 200 years of the commodification of nature and recently neoliberalism policies that seriously affected nature and biodiversity, we come again that, okay, we made some mistakes, let's fix it. But how? With again some financial regulations that again are going to invest on biodiversity to make some profits again for some private sectors that again come from global north. So this is something that we still criticize, even this very poor draft of post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which there are something that still seems that they are going to continue their current policies regarding biodiversity and nature. So as I think you studied political ecology, I wondered at what extent you think this kind of news, this kind of studies and recommendation can change the hegemony of this kind of discourse. So I don't, because I cannot see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali. Audrey, you have your.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sure others will have more to say to the broader point, but something that I wanted to say to your point about seeing biodiversity as separate from communities who are entangled with it is just that I think in the move towards these risk-based frameworks, there has definitely been and the attempts to like figure out how you would model biodiversity risk for an entire financial sector, an entire institutional investor. There have been movements back towards narrowing that frame, which has been fought for a long time to be expanded. And even as there is maybe a broader sense in the convention now that you must think about biological diversity and like communities and human rights together, these risk frameworks have narrowed that scope. And so actually many civil society organizations wrote a letter to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures that said that they were extremely alarmed that this new framework had kind of cut back on what seemed to be an expanding understanding of biodiversity. And so just to say that I think even when there's not like kind of a financialization in the sense that you are turning like a forest into a commodity for carbon, this other form of, I'm not sure if you would call it financialization or something else, but these risk-based frameworks that seem to be becoming more dominant have similar issues that have yet to be addressed in the frameworks that are now becoming extremely dominant.
Thank you, Audrey. Maybe Mark now, because I mean, what Audrey say can be perhaps connected to the also genesis of biodiversity in a way. I mean, the fact that you are saying, I mean, even the word and the concept of biodiversity is something that reflects some sort of classification. That was part of your point on the fact.
I mean, I think the reason I thought I would bring that in is because it suggests that biodiversity as an approach to well, let's say non-human nature, right? I mean, anthropologists have also challenged the very concept of nature, right? But as an approach to it, it lends itself very well to quantification, to measurement, and therefore to commodification, right? And to a kind of well, I mean, the point of biodiversity finance, however, is arguably to prevent, or perhaps it should be to prevent the commodification of ecosystems or of biodiversity. But then some would argue that its commodification helps to preserve it. I mean, this is part of the philosophy of natural capital, is that by recognizing certain kinds of good and quantifying them as such, they cease to be treated as externalities. You're putting a price on carbon, putting a price on biodiversity, and so on. And then you enter into the arguments about the global commons. A biodiversity good is actually part of a global commons, which shouldn't be privatized. But then what I found with the blue bond is that well, despite the fact that we think of the thinking about biodiversity is a kind of way of thinking in terms of quantification and measurement, which lends itself to economization. Actually, in practice, at least in this case, this isn't what's happening. It is kind of ring-fenced off. There are actually normal conservation practices going on, and it's the conservation governance that's being financialized in the name of biodiversity. So, I think to see how these processes work is useful to think about, well, what's been praised about the blue bond of Belize is that it's an ingenious way of protecting nature and reducing the debt burden on a developing country, right? But maybe there are other positive things and other less positive things. I mean, the criticisms, the most persuasive criticism that I've read so far about the Belize Blue Bond is not about the way that it manages biodiversity. It's not about the practice of Nature Conservancy, actually. It's about whether it's really financially sustainable. This is the thing. I mean, the accusation that the creditors agreed to taking a substantial haircut, 45%, I think it was, because they knew that if they didn't do that, they were going to lose even more money if they held on to their bonds, right? So, maybe Belize is, and so this is the worry is that, well, if Belize gets into trouble again in the future, maybe the whole house of cards is going to fall down, and the conservation, the biodiversity situation is going to suffer as well, and then nothing will have been achieved. But maybe as a way of using finance to treat conservation, maybe the national debt arrangement could have been made better by involving other creditors as well, having more of a multilateral arrangement, right? But possibly the conservation side of it was the right way to go. That's, sorry, a bit of a rambling.
There's another comment from Olivia. Maybe Olivia wants to intervene. I think we can still run the debate for another 5 minutes maximum, I would say, right, Daniele?
Yeah.
Because
So then
I don't know if
the time,
Olivia wants to ask the question herself.
Yeah,
Ciao, Olivia.
No, I mean, I've just been following with, this is a theme I looked into in the 90s. So for me, it's tremendous to hear the new debates and what language is being used. And of course, I have a slightly outdated perspective on the one hand, and on the other, I perhaps am beginning to feel old because I think, oh, didn't we try this and didn't it fail? Because really, Mark, I mean, I don't know whether it's very different from the bonds you're talking about, but debts for nature debt swaps were literally discussed in the 80s for deforestation. And I think, like for many things that end up in the big black box of neoliberal agendas, we really have to ask ourselves, if we tried it and we failed for decades, is there something we need to learn here? But overall, I mean, I don't really have an additional question because I think it's courageous that we are all trying to find ways of saving what we still have of living systems. But of course, the language, I think, I guess one of the things is you use the word for capital goes towards a certain agenda and a certain epistemic and ontological reification of attitudes, if not, agendas that are problematic and continue to be problematic. So I don't know. Yeah, sorry, that's not really a question, but more a reflection. But thanks for all the fantastic papers. Thanks, Giulia.
Thanks so much, Olivia. And I mean, maybe we should leave it with the criticality and high, ontological dilemma. And tomorrow we'll have 2 other panels that will hopefully give us more insight on communities and some example of green investment along the Belt and Road. And Daniele, if you want to close.
I just wanted to add that we may be also trying to leave, this room with a little bit of hope. I don't know really where to look for that, but, I just wanted to mention that, in a way. So not only with the criticalities, but yeah, it has been wonderful. So that's hope. I mean, this has been a wonderful thing.
I think
and discussion. So that's a reason for hope, to me at least. So I'm very grateful for that, and thank you everyone for being part of this. Really.
Thank you.
Many thanks. So
thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. See you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
And Giulia and Adi, if you want, you can stay for just a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Let's just wait.
I had so many issues with I will stop the recording.
Yeah, and then
it's still recording here. Can I stop right now? Yeah, why not?
I can't.
Let's stop.
I think I can't because when I entered the room, I wasn't an organizer. I'm so sorry for this connection issue.
I'm trying to.
Yeah, in the worst time, in the very beginning of the panel.